Good morning. I do want to just point out at each of the tables as you enter in, there are envelopes if you want to make a donation to Jeremy Christian Mission to help with the relief going on after the recent earthquake. It happened about 45 miles from them, so they're definitely affected. These are on the tables out there. Just want to really ask you, though, sometimes, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes when we have these special offerings, someone might decide to direct their offering from the regular general offering to this special need. And while that helps the need, it does make it a little challenge for the church. And so we just encourage you, if you're going to give a gift to Jeremy Christian Mission, that you would consider giving it over and above your regular giving here to FCC. That way they can be blessed with your help, and we can be blessed by your continued support. In December of 1942, during the height of World War II, the Italian 10th Army began an invasion of Egypt against British and French forces. While British and French forces lost 120 men in the fighting, the Allied army overwhelmed Italian forces, who lost nearly 2,000 soldiers during that battle. Over 133,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner by the combined army of the British and French fighters. After the battle, Winston Churchill said, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Now, keeping in mind that the book of Genesis is also known as the book of beginnings, today we come to the end of Genesis. Yet this is not the end of God's story, nor is it the beginning of the end of the story. Today's message is simply the end of the beginning. We spent time last week with Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham and Sarah, who was sold by his brothers when he was just 17 years old to slave merchants, who then brought the boy to Egypt, where he became a slave in the home of an Egyptian government official. For 13 years, Joseph was either a slave in prison, or he was a slave in Potiphar's home, or was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Now, though, because of the grace of God, he is the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. And at nearly 40 years old, Joseph encounters his brothers once again. When Joseph first identifies himself to them, they are terrified. They fear he will punish them for what they did so many years ago. And at that moment, with his brothers standing before him, with the power to punish them for what they did to him, Joseph has to make a choice that will impact him and affect him, his brothers, his father, and in fact will impact the course of history. We can only imagine the feelings and the emotions that must have welled up within Joseph as he realizes it is his own brothers standing before him, just as he had dreamed as a teenager they would. Now, we all know how difficult it is to forgive. Someone at some point did something to you that has left within you some deep, unhealed wounds. And it really doesn't matter who you are. Forgiveness is a difficult thing for all of us. In the New Testament, the Hebrew writer said, "Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." He's telling us that bitterness is a poison that just grows and grows and troubles and corrupts. And all of us struggle with bitterness at one time or another in our lives. You cannot live in this world very long without being hurt by another human being. And Jesus taught that one of the characteristics of a distinctive Christian is that we have the capacity to forgive. Jesus taught us, when you pray, say, "Forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me." In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, when you stand praying, If you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven can forgive you. And so as we look at Joseph today, I want you to think of someone that you might need to forgive. And maybe hold that person's picture in your mind. Now, the story of Joseph begins as a story of sibling rivalry gone bad. And it teaches that forgiveness is not impossible. And when forgiveness is given, it becomes one of the greatest heroic things that can happen in your life and in my life. Now, Joseph, when he was a teenager, still living at home, Joseph wasn't just an innocent victim in this ongoing rivalry with his brothers. Joseph definitely did some things that contributed to their envy and their anger and their jealousy and their hatred. It was fairly obvious to all who knew this family that Joseph was indeed the favored son of his father Jacob. And while Jacob had children from 4 different women, his most beloved wife was Rachel, who happened to be Joseph's mother. So Joseph was the favored son of his father, whose mother was the favorite wife of his father. Puts him in a pretty good position. And there are indications in Genesis that teenage Joseph wasn't hesitant to remind his brothers of his favored status. But once the father gives Joseph this beautiful, beautiful coat, it is the coat of many colors. The New International Version of the Bible describes the coat as richly ornamented. Apparently, this coat was very high-end. It was hand-tailored. It was not bought at Walmart or Target. It was custom-made just for Joseph. And it was evidence that their father will never love the brothers the way he loves Joseph. And the brothers cannot stand it. And they hate Joseph for it. Now, Joseph himself doesn't make matters any better. He actually fires them up even more when he has this dream that he chooses to share with his brothers. In his dream, his brothers are bowing down to him as he reigns and rules over them. Now, this goes against every rule and every law and every regulation and statute of Israel culture, where the older brothers will always rule over the younger. And so his brothers said to him with almost disgust in their voice, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And then Scripture tells us they hated him all the more because of the dream, because of what he said. And so Joseph is contributing to this situation. And this rivalry actually goes from bad to worse and worse and worse. And the brothers hate him more and more and more. And that is one thing about forgiveness that I want you to see this morning. In many instances, I understand not all, but in many instances, we have a contributing part to the broken relationship, to the hurt, to the anger that exists between you and this person that you need to forgive. In some way, you have likely contributed to their anger and to their hurt. Now, if you have experienced sexual abuse or physical or emotional abuse, you are an innocent victim, and you need to see yourself as such. But in those relational type of situations where we feel we've been hurt by someone we're close to, we feel like maybe they've betrayed us, maybe they've ridiculed you and it got back to you somehow, or they lied about you and they hurt your reputation, or they trusted or treated you in some way that you feel was wrong and unjust. Situations, it's a good idea to examine how you may have contributed to the broken relationship and to the angry feelings. Listen, what Joseph did in flaunting his favoritism of his father before his brothers, and the arrogance he likely displayed when he shared his dream with his brothers, none of that warranted what the brothers did to him. Yet it's still crucial to see that Joseph did have a role in provoking their anger and hatred of him. This doesn't justify the brothers' actions, but it does help us to understand why they were perhaps so hateful toward Joseph. And perhaps and maybe when they stood before Joseph 20 years later in need of food, perhaps Joseph said, wow, these are my brothers, and they did something really cruel to me. But I provoked them. I kind of caused their jealousy. I kind of rooted it on. I told them about this dream, and I was a bit arrogant when I did that. And then I just pranced around in this coat, and I was kind of, just making sure that they seen it. I made sure at every turn they knew I was Dad's favorite. Maybe that's why they hated me so much. Maybe that's why they did what they did to me. I played a role in this. Maybe I ought to just forgive them. And so if you're angry with someone, if you've been hurt by their actions and you are struggling to forgive, why not take some time, really analyze the circumstances and the situation that led up to this break in the relationship? And maybe just try to identify what part you may have played in the whole mess. Now, your behavior may not justify their actions, but likely their anger and their behavior is at least in part provoked by your behavior or your words. Just something to consider. What role may you have played in the breakdown and deconstruction of this relationship? Well, 20 years after this relationship break, when Joseph was just 17 years old, his brothers are now bowing before him, and he is now ruling over them, just like he dreamt. But he now has the power to exact brutal judgment upon them. But in the 20 years since that happened, God has matured Joseph. God has grown Joseph. And Joseph realizes how God had miraculously used the circumstances he found himself in to prepare his family so they could survive this famine that had come upon the region. And so Joseph urges his brothers, instead of punishing them, he says, go back and inform Dad I am still alive. And then you come and bring your entire household, including Dad, and you bring them to live here in Egypt. And I'm going to provide for all of your needs. I'm going to take care of you. And they do so. And Jacob and all of his household move to Egypt, and their relationship with Joseph is restored. 17 years after they moved, the father, Jacob, dies in Egypt. And once again, Joseph's brothers worry that Joseph still holds a grudge against them, and that with Dad out of the picture, he's going to be able to now take his revenge upon them. And so they come before him almost groveling, and they throw themselves down before him, and they start pledging their life to him and begging for his forgiveness. I want you to see what we read in Genesis chapter 50, beginning at verse 19. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. He spoke kindly to them. They had spoke such unkind words about him, but he chose to speak kind words to them. Joseph had fully forgiven his brothers. And listen, just as Joseph had been hurt deeply by those closest to him, all of us have been hurt by people with whom we are close. And the Bible instructs us to bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Joseph, who had once been a slave, and then in prison for a crime he did not commit. Joseph would have continued to live as a slave and as a prisoner if he had chosen not to forgive. Would have been emotional slavery. It would have been emotional prison. See, total forgiveness is the only way we will ever find freedom and release from our prison of hurt. And so the person who gains the most from forgiveness is the person who does the forgiving. You don't forgive others for their sake alone, but more so for your sake. And so make no mistake about it. Joseph's greatest act was not interpreting dreams or rising to the position of second in command or feeding a starving nation in a worldwide famine. His greatest heroic act was forgiveness. And sometimes it takes all the power available from heaven to offer this type of forgiveness for a wound that's been carried for years and years. But Joseph found that power, and he found that power in God. And that same power to forgive is available to you as well. I heard about an elderly man drove a big Lincoln Continental. He was coming upon a parking place on a crowded street. But before he could even put the car in reverse, a college student in a tiny sports car just whipped in behind him and parked right in that space. College student jumped out of the car and he was kind of laughing, and he says to the old man, "That's what you can do, Gramps, when you're young and quick." The old man put his car in reverse and he just began to pound that sports car until it looked like an accordion. He gets out and says, "That's what you can do when you're old and rich." You know, when Joseph's brothers deserved punishment, he granted them favor. And from this point forward, they lived together as a family should. Gone were the days of arrogance and pride, and favoritism and anger and envy and jealousy. One act of forgiveness ended years of pain and hurt. And so I want to finish up today by giving you 5 important truths about forgiveness. First of all, forgiveness is a decision. It's a decision. It is not a feeling. In fact, forgiveness goes against just about everything we feel in that moment. And just as love is an intentional choice regarding how you will choose to treat someone, forgiveness also is a choice. It is a decision that we make regardless of how we feel. And this is why Jesus instructs us to love our enemies and pray for those who hurt us, to go the extra mile, and to give the coat off of our back. Not because you feel like doing so, but because you choose to do so. Joseph decided to forgive his brothers, and he chose to bless them. He decided to be gracious and kind to them, despite all the hurt and the pain that he felt. And so don't miss the fact that Joseph still felt a lot of pain over what had happened. On more than one occasion, Joseph had to excuse himself from their presence when his emotions began to well up. In Genesis chapter 43, we read of this incident. When Joseph looked at his brothers, he hurried from the room because he was overcome with emotion. He went into his private room where he broke down and he wept. And after washing his face, he came back out and he kept himself under control. And my friends, those were real tears. And they were welling up out of the hurt and the pain that he felt. But Joseph knew the best way to deal with all of this internal pain and hurt was to forgive his brothers. See, holding on to all the bitterness and hurt that he felt toward them would only keep him in prison and rot away his soul. And so he decided to let go of it all, and he forgives them. And folks, that really is the best way to deal with the hurt and the pain you feel because of someone else's actions. A writer, Lewis B. Smedes, said, "Forgiveness does not always take away the hurt. It does not deny the past injury. It merely refuses to let them stand in the way of a new start." Don't let forgiveness and bitterness stand in the way of a new start. Forgiveness is a decision. Number two, forgiveness is ongoing. It's ongoing. Forgiveness is both a one-time event and an ongoing process. It begins with the initial decision to forgive, but it is also the process of continuing every day that attitude toward the offender. Trust me, even after you make the conscious and difficult decision to forgive someone who has hurt you in some way, every day you will have to decide to continue that same attitude, that same posture toward that person. Each day you're going to be tempted to just let the anger and the hurt take over and allow your bitterness to win out. But eventually, as time goes on and you just allow those memories and those thoughts to just recede into the background, those feelings are going to subside. But you're still going to have to fight against the hurt and the bitterness every day until forgiveness finally takes hold of you and you begin to really feel it. You've heard the statement, fake it till you make it. I think that applies to forgiveness as well. Sometimes we just have to fake it until it finally takes hold of us and we make it. So forgiveness is a decision, and it's an ongoing decision. Number three, forgiveness chooses to keep no record of wrongs. You know, you've heard the statement, just forgive and forget. Well, forgiveness is a decision, but forgetting is certainly not a decision. You don't decide to forget things. Now, what you can decide, what you can choose, is to not keep dwelling on those things, to not keep a record of those wrongs, to not use it against the person sometime in the future. You know, in all of the interactions that Genesis records Joseph having with his brothers, only once does he point back to what they had done to him. And that was only when he initially identified himself to them. And he says, "I'm Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into slavery." But that is the only time he ever brings it up again. And he quickly says to them, "But don't worry about it. It's fine." Listen, while you may not be able to completely erase the memory of what someone did to you in the past, you can work to not keep it in the forefront of your mind. You can choose to not bring those things up in the future in some sort of sneak attack. Listen, the words "you did this and you did that" are almost never helpful. If you cease reminding yourself of what has occurred and you don't keep bringing it back up, eventually the memory of what happened will fade into the background enough where you won't get so worked up about it when you do recall it. And so forgiveness chooses to keep no record of wrongs. Number four, forgiveness refuses to bring our own retaliation on the wrongdoer. Joseph had the power to punish. And maybe you have the power to get even. But forgiveness releases my right to hurt you back. If there is to be any punishment administered, I'm going to leave that in the hands of God, who is the perfect judge. That's why Paul told us in Romans 12:9, "Do not take revenge, my friends, but you leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." When his brothers stood before him, Joseph said, "I'm not God. It's God who will punish you if there is punishment due. I'm not God." And so sometimes we need to quit playing God by trying to bring retaliation and punishment on the wrongdoer. So what we as believers, what we say when we are wronged is, God, I'm just going to leave this up to you. If they've been wrong, then you will see that they are disciplined, that they're punished. It's not my job to make people pay. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that when a crime or an injustice is committed, we look the other way and we don't report it. I'm only talking here about our personal retaliation. If the act against you is likely criminal, absolutely report it. But then leave justice in the authority of the ones responsible for doling out justice. And if they fail, and in our system that often happens, then just leave the final justice to God. Just don't attempt to take matters into your own hands. Christian psychologist Archibald Hart said, forgiveness is relinquishing my rights to hurt back. Give up your right to hurt back. And finally, number 5, forgiveness seeks good in the life of the offender. Seeks good. And you know what? I think this is when you know you have really forgiven the person. When you genuinely in your own heart want good things to happen in the other person's life. And if you have any means of bringing that good to happen, you'll do so. That's how you know you've really forgiven the person. You know, Joseph could have just said to his brothers, hey, it's me, Joseph. You know, the brother you sold into slavery? You realize I have the power to have you tortured and put to death for what you did to me? But I'm not going to do it. Just get out of here and go back home. If I ever see you again in Egypt, I will be sure to punish you. I don't ever want to see you again. And you know what? I don't think anybody would have blamed Joseph if that's what he would have done. I mean, that would be merciful. See, mercy is when I can revenge a wrong, but I choose not to. So like when a police officer lets you off with a warning, that is mercy. But Joseph not only showed them mercy, he also blessed their life by inviting them and all of their household to come and live near him in Egypt, where he promises he will take care of them and provide for them. And that is grace. See, grace not only shows mercy, but it blesses in ways opposite of what the recipient really deserves. Grace is the police officer giving you a citation that costs $200 and then giving you $400 of his own money, $200 to pay the fine and $200 to go take care of some needs that you have. That's grace. So if it's within your power, within your capability, don't just forgive them, but bless them. Do something for them that advances their situation. If that's not possible, at least pray for them. Ask God to bring a blessing to their life in some way. In a few moments, we're going to take communion together. And you know, there are so many ways that you could connect the story of Joseph to what we remember here at the table of the Lord. Now, the brothers, they have assumed that all these years they had escaped accountability for what they had done to Joseph back when he was a teenager. But now they find themselves exposed. And their fate lay in the hands of the very one they sinned against. The time had come for them to face the facts and deal with their sin. But at this moment, standing in front of Joseph, who they had sinned against, who held their fate in his hands, they would have thought this is the worst possible scenario they could have ever imagined. How could their luck be so bad that they end up right in front of their brother 20 years later? But little did they realize, this worst case scenario was about to lead to the greatest blessing they could have ever imagined. Joseph held all the cards and could play them exactly as he wished. His brothers were completely at his mercy. And fortunately for them, not only was mercy extended, but grace was given as well. And ever since the days of Adam, we have tried to cover up our sin rather than confront it, be forgiven. But there comes a time for all of us when we're going to stand before the one we have sinned against, the one who holds our eternal fate in his hand. And if we're covered by the blood of Jesus, we're going to hear those words the brothers heard. Don't be afraid. I forgive you. Come, live with me.